Good afternoon, everybody. We're about to begin. And welcome to the Austrian Economic Forum at NC State University. Today we welcome Dr. Steve Horwitz from St. Lawrence University. Dr. Horwitz graduated cum laude with an AD degree in psychology and economics from the University of Michigan. He then went on to pursue his master's degree and PhD in economics from George Mason University. There he studied alongside the likes of Karen Vaughn, James Buchanan, and the great Don LeBeau. At St. Lawrence University, Dr. Horwitz is a Charles A. Dana Professor of Economics and the Department Chair. He is also an affiliated senior scholar at the Mercatus Institute in Arlington, Virginia, a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute in Vancouver, and a member of the Mount Berlin Society. He has written extensively on Austrian economics, Latvian political economy, monetary theory and history, and macroeconomics. Dr. Horwitz is the author of 2 books, Micro Foundations and Macro Foundations, An Austrian Perspective, and Monetary Evolution, Free Banking, and Economic Order. In 2010, he was awarded the Hayek Prize for his work on economics of the family, which is what he will be discussing today. With that, I welcome Dr. Horwitz.
Thank you, Roy, for arranging this, and I'm very happy to be here. Let me sort of give you a little bit of context for this paper, and then what I will do, what I plan to do anyway, is sort of talk my way through it. I'm working on the assumption that not everyone had a chance to read all of it, so I'll give you the ones through. We'll see how long it takes. It's useful to me to have plenty of time at the end left for your questions and comments, discussion. I don't know, we have 90 minutes total? Yes, yeah, okay, so plenty of time. And so this particular paper is headed for an edited volume of the Research Handbook on Austrian Law and Economics. So this is Roy's been certainly working on that topic since we were grad students, right, forever. So it seemed really nice to be able to come talk about that today. This paper, so first thing I should say is that project is not at the final stages yet. So one of the nice things about presenting this here is there is an opportunity for me to take your comments and to a next revision of this paper. So that is particularly useful for me. This paper draws on and extends some work that I did with Peter Lewin on a paper in the Review of Austrian Economics in 2008. That paper was on marriage, divorce, and the market process. I think was the title, something like that. And that paper is now chapter 6 in my brand new book, book number 3, which just came out within the last week or two, called Hayek's Modern Family. The subtitle is Classical Liberalism and the Evolution of Social Institutions, which you can get at fine book retailers, published by Palgrave. You can also get it cheaper at Amazon. You can also get it, I found out, at Target.com. So, if you want to go to Target and buy some underwear and some stuff for your kitchen, you can get my book while you're there too. So, also, this paper comes out of all of that work. One way to think about what this paper is trying to do and what that work on marriage and divorce is trying to do is to, I think the shortest version of it is to Austrianize Becker. Right? And if you think about Becker's work on marriage and family and all that stuff, it's kind of straightforward, obviously solid mainstream neoclassical economics. And in many ways, I think even from an Austrian perspective, right, to the degree that Austrians share with sort of mainstream basics of price theory, even though we frequently frame things differently, we emphasize different things, and certainly less of a focus on equilibrium outcomes. But we're still marginalists, right? And we're still using the economic way of thinking in the same sorts of ways. And so the work that Peter and I have been doing, did originally on this, and how this paper extends some of that, is an attempt to sort of look at the same kinds of questions about marriage and family and so on, but to provide a kind of Austrian take on the way someone like a Becker might look at it. So that's, I think, one way to think about what this paper is up to. This particular paper, because it was for a volume on law and economics, and I don't really, I'm not a law and economics person by any means, I thought it would be useful to sort of look at how the law and the structure of law affects the way in which, in this particular case, marriage and family are structured and the choices people make and so on, which is sort of traditional kind of way to think about that, and particularly the emphasis in here, as you can tell by the title, is on uncertainty and the coordination of human capital. So let me talk a little bit about kind of how I see the broad picture here, and then we'll talk about what is going on in this particular paper. So I think the key, and this is a way in which I think, by the way, that Austrians are, on this topic, are just like mainstream economists, non-Austrians, is the following. Families are like firms. Right? The analysis of the family we see in Becker and the literature over the last 50 plus years have come out of that. So to start with that assumption, we can think about families as being analogous to firms. It's not that they are firms, but they're like firms. Both marriage and the family can be understood as structures of human capital formed in the face of uncertainty and intended to create an ongoing enterprise of cooperation to achieve some set of goals at lower cost than the feasible alternatives. Right? And in many ways that could describe a firm. Though with families we tend to focus on human capital, of course, firms, both human and physical capital and other kinds of capital as well. When we think about the family, think about marriage, right? Structure of human capital formed in the face of uncertainty. You don't know when you marry someone, you're making your best guess. Same way when you hire an employee, right? Or even when you buy a machine, right? You don't know for sure what you're going to get out of it. Okay? And intended to create an ongoing enterprise of cooperation. That's what families are. That's what firms are. To achieve a set of goals, right? The purposeful action, right? At lower cost and feasible, imagined lower cost anyway, than feasible alternatives. Complicating this process when we think about families, right, is that there's the dual nature of the family, or households really more generally compared to firms, in which the members of households both produce for the market to earn income, but also engage in household production activities such as childcare, cleaning, cooking, mowing the lawn, all the kinds of things we might think about there. Families, households have this dual nature. They bring income in, they engage in household production. So there's multiple tasks there, multiple kinds of tasks in a way that isn't quite true of firms. In addition, we can think of household production as including production of the leisure activities that the married couple or the full family might enjoy together. So it's not just childcare, cooking, cleaning, but we like to go on trips together, we like all the things we might like to do together as a family, consumption activities, right, are part of what that household produces. Assuming that not all of these household wants can be satisfied by market alternatives, right? That is, presuming we don't eat dinner out every night, for example, or we don't hire someone who cleans everything in our house, that some of those activities have to be done within the household. Married couples have to be concerned about two kinds of human capital that they might bring to a marriage. What we might call their market-oriented human capital, which is their ability to earn an income on the market, and also their household-oriented human capital, which is their ability to engage in those tasks in the household. Given that families have to solve both of those problems, both types of human capital are important. And one way we can think about successful marriages and families are that they are, what they are families, marriages, in which this dual human capital structure is sufficiently complementary to enable the members to satisfy both sets of wants. And again, generate income and output, including the kind of subjective, emotional, psychological benefits of marriage and family life that are superior to alternatives, right? So you can see, and I'm going to talk some more about this in a couple minutes, but you can see if you know a little bit about Austrians, how Austrians think about capital. I'm going to say more about that in a minute. You can start to see where I'm headed here, right? This idea of a complementary structure of human capital that defines families. So what would a law and economics analysis of marriage and the family look like from a broadly Austrian perspective? Well, I think it would explore the ways in which the law facilitates or complicates the coordination process by which couples form marriages and decide on these questions of market and household production, including issues related to the number of children that they have, how they're cared for. All the kinds of decisions that we think about families making are certainly affected by the law, and the way in which law in particular can help reduce uncertainty. Because Austrian economics assumes a world of uncertainty and disequilibrium, it tends to conceptualize market processes and as well as non-market human action more generally as an ongoing process of discovery in a world full of fallible actors with limited knowledge. In such a world, the challenge for law and economics is taking seriously what Mario Rizzo in a 1980 article termed the role of law amid flux. What does law do in a world of fluctuations and uncertainty and the sort of choice context that Austrians talk about? From this perspective, the relationship between law and human action, right, law and economics, is less about generating efficiency than it is about facilitating coordination. And certainly going back to Hayek and Mises in the 1920s and 30s, Austrians have emphasized the way in which markets are about the coordination of human plans and the role played by prices and other social institutions in facilitating that coordination process by enabling actors to overcome the limitation to their individual knowledge. What Ludwig Lockman, the Austrian economist, said of social institutions, including the law, is that they are nodal points of society. This is a quote from Lockman. Nodal points of society coordinating the actions of millions whom they relieve of the need to acquire and digest detailed knowledge about others and form detailed expectations about their future action. And so what I'm trying to do in this paper, this whole line of work, is to explore the way in which several specific laws affect the attempts of marital partners and families more generally to coordinate their behavior and form the complementary structures of human capital that are necessary to accomplish both market and household production. So that's the, if you're a music person, that's the overture. Okay? That's some of the main themes I want to talk about. So, more specifically, let me say a few words about Austrian capital theory, for again, those of you who aren't super familiar with it. And my little section title in my notes here is Austrian Capital Theory, Human and Otherwise. So first, let's talk about the general idea of capital. For Austrians, the key task we face is planning, again, in the face of an uncertain future. How do firms do that? Firms do that by gathering together resources, both physical capital and human capital, and gathering them together in ways that the entrepreneur perceives to be complementary. The entrepreneur, in the entrepreneur's own mind, thinks, all right, I've got these people, I've got these machines, I've got these other things, all these inputs, all these things together form in my head as the entrepreneur a complementary structure of capital, both human and physical, that I think will produce the good that I imagine people will find to be valuable, and that will produce profit. Right? That's the imagined task that the entrepreneur is undertaking. Of course, what happens in the real world is we test those. Right? You can think of that as the entrepreneur's plan for the use of capital would be like a scientific hypothesis, which we want to test. And the test for entrepreneurs is, in fact, we make profit from it. If entrepreneurs discover that they haven't, they have to rethink that structure of capital and decide, okay, now instead of seeing it as complementary, I have to think about substitution. How might I take other workers or other capital and swap those in and swap things out and change what I'm doing and restructure my capital structure in ways that I think will be more profitable. Now, a little footnote here, right? Married people don't normally do that, right? Sort of start swapping out partners every time something goes bad, right? That would be problematic. We can talk about the reasons that marriage, in particular, and families don't do that. They don't operate in a market context as part of it, right? Where the feedback to their success or failure is much longer term. So in that sense, if we think about the firm as being this, again, complementary structure of heterogeneous physical and human capital, that word heterogeneous is important here too, right? Both for human and physical capital. For Austrians, capital is not just sort of this lump of stuff that we dole out like ladles from a giant pot of soup, right? Capital is embodied in particular physical objects, or in the case of human capital, particular human beings, who are different. They have different skills, they have different abilities. Machines can produce different things at different costs, and figuring out how to make them fit together is the key. My good friend Pete Becky has, I think, a terrific analogy here. He says, for Austrians, capital is not like Play-Doh, right? It's not like clay that you can smush into any old shape. It's more like Legos, right? Where the pieces have definite shapes that have to be put together, and there's only a limited number of ways that they can fit together. And for Austrians, that's a key to thinking about capital, human and otherwise, which is when we think about how to make capital structures complementary, the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, they have to fit together in certain sorts of ways, right? And so that, of course, how well they fit together will depend upon the particular tasks. What's the goal? So when we think about a firm, if you're trying to produce running shoes, that's quite one side. If you're thinking about marriage or a family, what are we trying to produce? We're trying to earn income, we're trying to raise children, perhaps, we're trying to produce consumption goods, whatever it might be, right? Those are the kind of things we have to think about. Again, the Austrian perspective on human capital lets us view marriage, and by implication the family, as an attempt to create an integrated structure of human capital within a household that's consistent with the plan the couple has to engage in the market and household production necessary to sustain that household. And the family's plan can either succeed over time or fail, just as with a firm. Again, different process, but it can succeed or fail. In the paper, the one figure I have in the paper is that one that sort of looks at the different types of human capital. If I remember correctly, it's on page 8, maybe? 6. Okay? And if that figure kind of gets at when we think about human capital, particularly in the context of the family, right, what matters. And this is the distinction I made earlier among market and household. And we can also break each of those down to be general and specific. We know when we think about human capital in the market, sometimes we can think in terms of very general human capital that people need for labor markets, being on time, being responsible, all those kind of things. But specific things too, right? Like the skills you need for a particular job. Same is true in the household, right? There's general kinds of household capital that people have, the ability to clean or cook or take care of children. But there's also specific household human capital that might be specific to a particular relationship or specific, you know how to deal with your spouse, right? Or more importantly, I think, you know how to raise your kids because you know them, right? There can be general parenting skills, but there can also be fairly specific parenting skills that apply to the particular children in question. So we can think in those terms as well, right? And again, when we think about the ways in which families are these integrated structures of human capital, we need to consider all of those things. So one way to understand marriage, right, is as a complementary human capital combination, right? That's what, in a sense, that's what marriage is. And when we think about it from an Austrian perspective, remembering that that's an attempt to create that complementary structure in the context of uncertainty and not knowing for sure whether it will work out or not. And again, the goal here is to accomplish both market and household production. What sorts of combinations of human capital will be the most complementary will depend both upon the human capital of the prospective marriage partners and their preferences about things like market income versus working in the household, what their labor-leisure trade-offs are, all the kind of traditional things we do in that sort of labor market analysis of household decision-making play into this too. But the Austrian emphasis, though, is on thinking in terms of the heterogeneity of that human capital and the challenge people face in finding the right combination that does the kind of things that they want to do. One historical note here, of course, is that for most of human history, marriage, the human capital that mattered for marriage was human capital that was about your ability to earn market income. Because for most of human history, right, marriage and family was indistinguishable from a firm in the sense that was where work happened. If you think about agricultural families, if you think about small cottage industries, right, it was the family producing. You worked within the family, right? The family was the firm earning income those ways. And we know one of the ways we know that is, right, last names reflect occupations, Taylor, Baker, Fletcher, right, all those kinds of things. Okay? And what's happened, and in the book, I argue that this is one of the great things about capitalism, is that capitalism took all of that production out of the family, most of it anyway, and put it into the marketplace and opened up the family to the kinds of emotional and psychological and consumption-oriented satisfactions that we have now. Right? Whereas many hundred years ago, you might have looked in a marital partner for someone who you could work with on a farm, or perhaps was able to bear and nurture many children because you needed them to work, right, on farm or wherever. Right? And so it was about production-oriented matches of human capital. Today, when we marry someone, we tend not to, at least in developed countries, we tend not to think about that. It's more complementarity of our consumption preferences. Right? What does this person like to read? Do they ski? I like to ski. Do they ski? What do they like to eat? And so those kind of things become important too when we think about what makes for that complementarity within a marriage. Of course, they still have people who want to have kids, for example, still have to think, will we parent well together and all these kinds of things. But consumption activities have become much more important than market production kinds of activities. All right, so how does the law figure into this? As I said earlier, unlike the firm, the family does not have an unambiguous measure of success or failure, such as profit and loss. At some level, right, the most basic level, the continuation of a marriage indicates that it's being successful at least some portion of its plan, right? Even if, say, the couple staying together for the benefit of the children, right? That's not unimportant, okay? That's part of their plan, is to raise those children well, right? The successful upbringing of children is often a central part of why people get married and why perhaps they stay married. On the downside, right, divorce seems clear evidence of planned failure. right? Or at least, if not planned failure in some strict sense, at least the exhaustion of the benefits of this relationship. You can think about divorce. Divorce can happen because you just can't figure out the right way to make this thing work. But it can also be that you've exhausted what you had together, right? That you simply, we sold this product. Nobody wants the product anymore. I mean, with the market analogy, right? So we close up. It's not that it's not that somehow our own sort of planning was a failure, but rather the thing just people don't want it anymore, right? Or whatever it might be. In any case, right? The assumption, the failure of a marriage reflects costs and excessive benefits, right? So, but that can again be either due to the couple exhausting the benefits of their relationship, or some change that raises the costs, or both. In either case, on the assumption that the plan was understood to be an indefinite one, right, till death do us part, that divorce is evidence of some form of plan failure. And because plan failure is linked to the reliability of expectations, an Austrian understanding of marriage and family would have to understand the ways in which such expectations are formed and the role that particular institutions play, like the law, in assisting that process. So in looking at the law and economics of the family, we can narrow that exploration to several legal rules that affect the family formation process and the ways in which human capital is accumulated and labor is divided within the family, all of those processes. And seen in this light, the law becomes central to the process by which families are formed and succeed as ongoing enterprise, to the effect the law has on the accumulation of various types of human capital and the formation of plans based on the complementarities in the structure of people's human capital. To the degree law makes it easier for us to better coordinate our plans with other people, better coordinate our human capital, right? It will facilitate better marriages and better outcomes. To the extent it makes it more difficult, we should see problems. So in the paper, I offer 3 applications of this. The first is to a set of issues around custody, human capital, and what sociologists call the second shift. We'll talk about what that is. Then also talk a little bit about no-fault divorce. And then finally, I talk about something a little bit more radical, which is the idea of multi-parent families. So let me say a little bit about each of those, mindful of my time as well. So the custody decisions question, right? This starts with the law. In the law today, it's still the case that mothers are still much more likely to get the majority of physical custody in a divorce. And I emphasize physical custody there, right, as opposed to legal custody, right? What matters for the household questions are which house are the kids in. Both parents can still have rights over the kids, but their physical location is what matters. But this is a digression we can maybe talk about later, but one way to think about divorce, when a divorce happens with young children, it's basically you've got a firm with 2 branch offices, right? And the kids keep moving between the 2 branch offices, and there's all kinds of interesting principal agent problems, right, that arise when you're trying to co-parent in 2 branch offices of the same firm. But that's an interesting digression that we might talk about. So the question is, what incentives does this create if mom's more likely to get the kids and mom worries about divorce? In a world where 40%, depending on what measure you use, of marriages end in divorce, right? And particularly where one of the prime times for marriages to end in divorce is early on in the first 10 years of a marriage, where often there's young children involved, right? What's the effect on, what are the incentives this creates for mom, right, if she's worried about divorce? Well, one problem is she's torn between perhaps wanting to increase her market-oriented human capital, because if she's thinking, if I get divorced, I might have to earn more income than I'm earning right now. So if she's a stay-at-home mom, earn income at all, right? Market income. But at the same time, she might be thinking, I have to be mindful of my household-specific human capital, household-oriented human capital. Because if we do get divorced, I'm going to get most of the care of the kids. And so how do I balance those to being pulled at both ends, right? And this often becomes a major time squeeze for women, and that might make accumulating either more difficult. But what are the incentives for dad? For one thing, dad's incentive to accumulate household human capital, that is to become more specialized and to engage in the production, in household production, and do work around the house, that incentive falls, right? If he believes that custody, physical custody of the kids is a cost. All right? Part of this is that since he's not going to have to bear that cost, most of the cost, he's in a better bargaining position. Right? He can say, well, why do I have to help out around the house? What are you going to do, divorce me? Right? And if he does, right, if he thinks getting the kids is a cost, right, he can play that strategy. All right? He also might anticipate high support payments, dad might, right, having to pay for child support and perhaps support to his spouse as well, which might lead him in the direction of investing more in his market-oriented human capital and less around the house. Right? And notice, too, that both of these things can exacerbate whatever tensions that pre-existed that might be leading both parties to think about divorce and make the likelihood of divorce seem higher. One of the strange things here, one of the things about thinking about these issues this way, we often find that there's self-fulfilling prophecies that happen here. Right? As people begin to worry about divorce, they're often led to take steps that might make that a more likely outcome. And that's interesting kind of, if you want to think of it as like a hysteresis problem or something, right? This kind of, how do we prevent that from happening is an interesting question. From an Austrian perspective, these endogenous processes can undermine, again, the complementarity of that human capital combination on which the marriage was based. One small exogenous shift in the health of a relationship that increases the possibility of divorce can trigger this endogenous response that widens that crack to the point of undermining the whole venture. Right? If we imagine marriage as a plan based on expectations of future problems to be solved and an imagined structure of our human capital to solve them, right, should the actual human capital structure that both parties have turn out not to be what people expected it to be, right, and be unable to meet the needs of both partners and the family as a unit, that's a kind of plan failure. And we have the kind of equivalent of losses to a firm. Is that a question? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so
I couldn't tell if that was just
sorry,
go ahead. Yeah.
half a question. So from my understanding, divorce is actually a very expensive and sometimes lengthy process. So it's not, we don't quite have free exit from the market like
Correct.
we often do. So does the complication of divorce in fact preserve more marriages? Does that work in the opposite effect of what you're thinking? Why would you, if you're the breadwinner of the family, wouldn't you still want to specialize in household things so that you can avoid that huge cost of divorce?
Yeah, though what might matter here is relative costs and on the margin, right? So if you are the breadwinner, well, there's a couple complications. If you're the breadwinner, you're probably better able to bear the costs than the non-breadwinner. The family is special, right? If they're both working in the market, that changes things, okay? It also turns out, by the way, so I have to, Roy's probably laughing at this one. I have to put in a little footnote here, which I'm actually going through a divorce right now, so I'm going to speak from experience about some of these things. This one I can speak from experience about. In a lot of states, the one with the, if there's a large income difference between the spouses, the one with the higher income is obligated to help the one with the lower income pay the cost of divorce, right? So like lawyers' fees, right? So if you do have a couple that specializes, the one who specializes in household production, the cost, it may not be a barrier, usually her, but could be him, right? We'll say her. But you're right, on the husband, right, this may be now it's not just his cost of divorce, but hers as well. So if you think, we could draw a little model up here if we wanted, right? But certainly how costly divorce is will raise the threshold at which people say, that's it, we went out. So it's not free exit. But if you think about a firm too, right? If a firm is, the shutdown decision for a firm, right? There's no legal barrier there, but certainly you're going to lose value in assets, and there may be costs of closing up the firm and getting an accountant to come in and clean out the books and everything, right? So again, it can be analyzed in those same kinds of ways. And I think the question is, how fixed are those costs and who's bearing more? Does that help? Yeah. Again, I should say, feel free to jump in with questions if you have them as I'm going along. So what's interesting about thinking about these endogenous processes, it can help explain a puzzle that folks, particularly sociologists, have found this puzzle interesting, which is, and economists too. So let me start with the economist story. Some of you may be familiar with Mackenzie Tulloch's book, The New World of Economics, which was written in the mid-'70s. It was one of these first books that kind of took the Becker stuff, right, and sort of applied economics to all these interesting questions. And they have a wonderful chapter on marriage, divorce, and child production in there. And in a footnote, In 1975, they make the following prediction. As men's and women's wages become more equal, the time that men and women spend engaged in housework should become more equal as well. Right? It's a basic opportunity cost argument, right? Because as opportunity costs level, it should be the case that both parties find engaging in housework to be equally costly, so it should be split more evenly. And in fact, we've seen wages largely equalize. Turns out, it hasn't happened. It has happened some, but not nearly as much in terms of work done in the house. But it turns out both men and women do less work in the house than they used to. That's not surprising. And the gap between men and women has narrowed, but still is significant and much larger than any decent measure of the wage gap. And so it's an interesting puzzle. Why, as women's market opportunities have equaled out, why hasn't the household equaled out in the same way? And sociologists, you might imagine, have a bunch of different explanations for this, which might have things about gender roles and so on, which again, I don't want to suggest aren't true, they might be. But this story gives us perhaps another part of that picture, which is with the increased likelihood of divorce, it may well be the case that that increased likelihood creates, again, these incentives and responses that creates fewer incentives for men to engage in household production compared to women. All right? And so part of what might be happening here is the fact that women tend to be favored with physical custody has these feedback effects, and one of those feedback effects is it enables men to not have to work as much in the household because that puts that expectation of custody puts them in a better bargaining position. And there's the empirical evidence here that I'm aware of. There might be, it's not inconsistent, I think would be the phrase that I would use. All right. So that's some thoughts about the custody and human capital and the second shift, meaning the household production question. What about no fault? One thing I'd say about no fault is that it's probably a misnomer, as several people pointed out. What we really have is a system of divorce by unilateral demand. Right? If one party wants to leave the marriage, they can do so. That didn't used to be the case, right? Divorce had to be for a reason, usually abuse, abandonment, adultery, right? And that involved some form of consent by both parties. But with no fault, right? If you want out of the marriage for whatever reason, you can do it, and the other party can't stop you. And historically, the now no fault has argued, and it's probably right, that this has weakened women's bargaining position. Okay, because again, women are more likely to be committed to household production, right? And they risk being left by their husband and being relegated to a fairly precarious financial position. Right? What's interesting, of course, is that many women have historically supported no fault and thought moving to no fault was a good thing, and presumably because it allowed many women to leave deeply unhappy marriages and potentially abusive ones, even at a financial cost. But one thing we might ask from an Austrian perspective is whether no fault was an endogenous response to the increased uncertainty around gender roles, and therefore a response to the changes in the complementarity of marital human capital combinations that emerged in the 1960s. So here's what I want to suggest here, right? One explanation for the increase in divorce rates, one possible explanation for that increase in divorce rates that took place in the 1970s and 80s, is that there were a number of marriages formed in the 60s and 70s in which the partners faced increased uncertainty about each other. And the increased uncertainty was about the likelihood of them, particularly women, being in the labor market versus being at home. And that increased uncertainty led to incorrect expectations about, in fact, the complementarity of their human capital, and therefore led to the plan failure we think of as what we call divorce. Specifically, the change in gender roles that we began to see throughout the 1960s had two implications. First, it was harder for men to know what to expect from prospective female partners with respect to their preferences about market and household production. In economic terms, signals in the marriage market became very noisy, and new ways of making clear what a prospective partner was, quote, really like, right, or would be like in the future had yet to really emerge. And a consequence of this was that more marriages were likely to involve mismatched human capital thanks to those noisy signals. The second problem was that women themselves often guessed wrong about what they would be doing later in life. Survey data indicates that in the late 60s, only a minority of college-age women, women in college, I should say, I'm take that, college-age women, expected to be in the labor force at age 35. Only a minority did. but that a strong majority of those same women were in fact employed when they turned 35. So women in the 1960s and into the early 70s were misguessing their own future role in the labor market. Their inaccurate expectations of their own future often led to them underinvesting in human capital. It's one of the common explanations, at least partial explanations, of the gender wage gap, at least at that time. These data also suggest that some marriages ended up with two working spouses, despite the fact that neither one expected or perhaps desired that outcome. And that mismatched structure of human capital might certainly threaten the sustainability of the marriage and possibly contribute to rising divorce rates. No fault can be seen as an endogenous effective institutional adaptation to that situation. With more bad matches happening thanks to that greater uncertainty, it wouldn't be a surprise to see a desire to reduce the cost of divorce and make it easy to exit failing marriages. No fault has drawbacks, no question, particularly again around the women's financial situation. But the advantages of lower exit costs, and that goes back to your question, right, in a period of uncertainty would have been significant. The easier, in a world of uncertainty, the more flexibility people have, the better. And the interesting part here is in the last couple decades, divorce rates have stabilized. There's also some evidence that among younger cohorts, the divorce rate's slightly falling. Marriage rate, of course, has also fallen, and that suggests that what we may be seeing today are fewer but better marriages. And the revolution in gender roles of the 60s and 70s has settled into more predictable patterns. And young people maybe have figured out how to more clearly signal what they expect from marriage. And women are, we have survey data to support this, women are forming more accurate expectations of their own future. In fact, now, women slightly overestimate the likelihood of being in the labor market at age 35. Just slightly, okay? And so this shift might also, by the way, explain, if all this is true, what we're getting in marriages are more sustainable combinations of human capital. And this may actually explain some of the desire on some people's part to rethink no-fault. Okay? And there's a good economic argument for moving to mutual consent, right? That divorce by mutual consent enables Coasian bargaining to take place, right? It enables the two parties to sort of find an agreement that you know, what's the price at which you're willing to get out? You can think of that, again, I don't go into it much in the paper here, but in other places I have. You can think in terms of divorce by consent, and I shouldn't say just me, plenty of economists who look at this, right? I've talked about the idea of making divorce by, the advantage of divorce by consent is it allows the person in the weaker bargaining position, who would be in the weaker bargaining position, to have some leverage, right, to look to find side payments, right, to persuade the other person to accept the divorce. The question is, again, whether we think that is worth that increase in the cost of exit is worth it. Right? With fewer but better marriages, thanks to reduced uncertainty, a less open-ended divorce process might now be a more effective way for legal institutions to lead to more coordinated expectations. So last application is this idea of multi-parent families. Right? And what do we mean by this? Well, in a world of high divorce rates and remarriage, we tend to see families that have more than two what we might call de facto parents. People who are engaged in the acts of parenting, even if they don't have the de jure, the legal rights to be a parent. Let's think about a step-parent, right? Mom and dad, you know, biological parents get divorced, say mom remarries, the kids live with mom and the stepfather. The stepfather is engaged in parenting activity, even though he may have no legal parenting rights to raise children. That situation creates both uncertainty about which parents can do what, and also higher transaction costs of sorting those issues out, right? You have to have, the step-parent has to have medical consent forms, the step-parent can't sign a permission slip from school, so you have to find the parent to do it, right? All these kinds of things that require the legal parent's, say, signature or approval become more complicated. And current law contributes to these problems by only, in most cases, recognizing two parents. So a lot of recent research by Austrians has been focusing on the endogeneity of legal and social norms. But earlier work had looked at the way in which the spontaneous order of the market and other social processes depended crucially on the nature of those framing institutions like monetary system and the law. The more recent work is asking whether those framing institutions themselves are also the products of unplanned evolutionary processes. And if so, might we get better institutions if we allow those processes to work and we try to design money or the law, say, from the top down? If framing institutions work better when they have this bottom-up evolutionary process behind them, it's probably because they're better able to solve the problems in the specific context in which they operate, right? And particularly if that context changes, allowing bottom-up responses to that changing context is going to give us better law, right? Because it'll respond, again, to the nature of the changes in those problems. Even as existing law might have been effective in a world where divorce and remarriage was rare, that law might need to change in response to those changes in family structure. And a number of proposals for addressing the multi-parent family situation challenge the assumption that there must be no more than two parents. And most of them open the box of parental rights to more than two, and they often parallel the way in which the law already recognizes the complexity of custody arrangements, right? Judges can tinker with this a little bit, but they can't make sort of more than two people legally the parents. The way that people are talking about this issue is strikingly similar to the way in which Austrians and other economists have talked about property rights. Rather than view the right to a piece of property as a single, undifferentiated thing, work in the last, and Demsetz and Forward, others, right, I think in the last few decades, has seen property rights as a bundle of different rights that get put together in different configurations under different circumstances. Some property rights include the ability to use property in ways that other property rights do not. Such limits might be negotiated by parties to a contract, but others might adhere in a specific piece of property or the type of property, thanks to years of evolved case law. We can also talk about the way in which the work of Eleanor Ostrom suggests that institutions that look like private property in a number of ways, but not always, can often be effective means for dealing with common pool resource problems. Property rights may not entail the identical set of specific rights and obligations in all circumstances. Right? We can separate, again, different kinds of use rights, which may or may not be part of any given bundle of property rights. Once the right of private property is understood as a set of specific rights bundled together, we can discover more effective ways the law might fine-tune those bundles, to the particular rights, the problems those property rights are trying to solve. So the argument for opening up parental rights to more than two people is analogous. Parental rights, like property rights, can best be seen as a bundle of specific rights that parents have with respect to their minor children. In much of the law now, the assumption is that there's two parents, both of whom have pretty much the same set of rights. However, one can imagine challenging both of those assumptions, with perhaps 3 or even 4 adults, let's say both parties divorce, get remarried, and have some physical custody of the kids, all of whom have some responsibility for a child. Why not extend the number of rights bundled in what we now call parental rights to the non-biological or non-adoptive parents? If the law helps reduce the transaction costs of interaction, refusing to extend at least some of the parental rights beyond two parents makes for more complicated and costly interactions among those concerned with the welfare of the child. If the law, like other institutions, evolves endogenously in response to changes in the external environment for which it serves as a coordination process, then as the problems change, so should the law. And this sort of change in law is something we're beginning to see in a small number of states. Right? We're beginning to challenge this. A more radical and perhaps more effective change would be to not just expand the number of parents, but to unbundle the rights. There's no reason that a step-parent couldn't have the right to make decisions about health care or to sign a school permission slip without necessarily having other sorts of parental rights or even the same financial obligations as the biological parents. Courts already divide up custody agreements in all kinds of creative ways. So what is to stop the law from recognizing that some rights might best belong to more than two parents, but others not? The American Bar Association has drafted some model legislation on how such arrangements might work, and some similar schemes are in place in places in Europe. Here too, if social institutions like the law are not just frameworks for the emergence of spontaneous order, but are themselves emergent phenomena that respond to changes in the way in which humans interact, then it shouldn't surprise us that the greater prevalence of multi-parent families might call forth the need for the law to evolve in response. So let me just conclude with a couple of thoughts. Looking at the law and economics of the family through the eyes of the Austrian school helps us to see 2 key points of analysis that other approaches might overlook. First, Austrians understand the role played by law as a node of social coordination in a world of uncertainty. The law helps actors to formulate more accurate expectations of the actions of others and thereby promote social cooperation and coordination. The law, therefore, needs to be a solution to and not a cause of uncertainty. This perspective illustrates how the challenges facing modern marriage and family law, especially those concerning divorce, are driven by the way in which law frames people's ability to overcome uncertainty and to achieve, again, cooperation and coordination. In particular, recent Austrian work on the endogenous generation of rules, including the law, can help to see how the law can and often must change in response to new coordination problems. And then second, the Austrian understanding of capital, including human capital, sheds light on what makes for a sustainable marital partnership and provides a way of describing in more detail the nature of the coordination problem marriage involves. To the degree that law facilitates rather than complicates the creation of better marriages, or the creation of complementary human capital structures between marital partners, it will contribute to better marriages and fewer divorces. Marriage and family, like business ventures, are voyages into the unknown that will work best when the surrounding institutions facilitate good signaling processes that help people coordinate in the face of that uncertainty. Looking at the contemporary family through that lens sheds some new light on both new and old problems. So thank you. I know that was a lot. Yeah, you can applaud. Just do applause. All right, so I'm happy to take more questions, and I've got out my pencil and make some notes. That's how people scribble or something. Yes, ma'am.
So
Yeah.
you
Remind me your name again.
Kelsey,
Kelsey.
if we're after regulation that reduces uncertainty, why not pass a law that says you can't get married until you're either 35 or you've cohabitated with that person for 4 years?
Oh, excellent. All right, so we tell you, I told my daughter's almost 20, and she's in this, not surprisingly, in this sort of I hate marriage mode, right? And I said to her, look, marriage is awesome, but you just gotta be sure, right? That's the 35, right? You just gotta, the more certain you are, the better. I mean, there's plenty of people who get married before 35, right? Who know that it's the thing. I think the more interesting part of that is the living together part, right? So here's a piece of data to think about. The evidence is pretty clear that people who live together for a long time before they get married are actually more likely to divorce than people who don't. Anyone know the answer? The reason for that? Paul, I saw you nodding, Paul.
Yeah, I've heard that before. I don't know if there is a the answer.
The end, yeah. And a possible explanation.
Well, my understanding has been that it's that marriage is something special, and then when you hit marriage and you get your house together, it's not his house, it's not her house, it's our house, and then there's this break in your life, and then that's a separation. But if you're just sort of cohabitating, then you just get married, and you're just kind of going on, it's not a big deal. And so why not just get divorced? And so there's this, I don't know if it's a stigma or it's a psychological thing, but because it's not such a big deal in your own mind, why not get divorced?
I think that's part of it. The more common I think.
I was just my stab would be that, more traditional people who are more likely to be, honoring cultural mores and norms and whatnot are less likely to get divorced and less likely to shack up together,
Yeah,
live
I
in
think
sin.
that's probably that's something too. Got another one. Why aren't they getting married?
Yeah, that's,
Yeah, go ahead, Steve. Yeah.
well, I think if you can't make up your mind, then you're not convinced you found.
That's the one, yeah.
That one.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, so people who live together for a long time, that's a signal that they're not sure this thing is the thing, right?
Yeah.
And so it shouldn't surprise us when they do get married, and I think it's not inconsistent with your story, Paul.
Yeah.
Yeah, when they do get married, that they're more likely to divorce, because you could flip it the other way. If they were meant for each other,
Yeah.
quote unquote, they would have got married already. I mean, you can argue they would have been married earlier. So the fact that they've hesitated indicates that there's something at work there that might predict divorce later. So there's all kinds of those interesting paradoxes with marriage. So go back to your question, why, the answer is, well, do we really want to, living together may not, I have a friend, a college friend who said, the way to know whether you can marry someone is you have to spend 48 hours in a hotel room with them. You can't leave, and you can't fool around. And if you can spend 48 hours in a hotel room with someone under those conditions, you can marry them. So that's an interesting, that's not living together, that's something else, that's a kind of intense torture chamber or something like that, right? But, and there's all kinds of things like that, right? I actually think another way to know if you can marry someone is get a pet together. Get a pet together. Now, you'll learn some things right away. It's a lot easier than having a child first and then getting married later, right? But that was a joke. But yeah, get a pet together. So yeah, so I think, and the other bottom line is that we're reluctant on cost-benefit grounds to interfere with decisions that we think people should be, they're in a better position to know whether their partnership, even in the face of uncertainty, is a workable one than we are passing. Again, there was some tongue-in-cheek to that proposal, but that we would be in sort of saying, you can think about all the ways in which we might do that. In fact, there's several states now have these covenant marriage laws. I can't remember if I mentioned in the paper or not. I might have these covenant marriage options for people, right, where couples can agree to what's called covenant marriage. It's a legal term. This is a legal term. That where they have to go. Usually it works. They have to go through a series of sort of premarital counseling to make sure they're ready. If they agree to this kind of marriage, the exit costs are much higher. There's different divorce rules that apply to it. So if you agree to this kind of marriage, you're agreeing to a marriage that looks more like prenuptial. In the states that have offered this, the percentage of couples who take it up to like 1%, 2%. Right? So this doesn't seem like very popular, which suggests that people really do want flexibility, both lower costs of entry and exit, right, would be the economic, right? That the problem with the covenant marriage is it raises the cost of entry. And of course, the other thing about marriage is, of course, the tougher you make divorce, the more you discourage marriage, right? Everything else equal, right? If divorce is tougher, people don't want to get married, right? If you make divorce easier, then the cost of exit are lower. Again, ceteris paribus, right? So there's all kinds of interesting paradoxes. Yeah, what?
Steve, as I read this, I was thinking that, are you assuming much more knowledge of divorce law than people who are married typically have? Because you're saying to respond to all these sentences, and I think most people don't know a thing about divorce law until they get ready to get divorced, in which case, all that stuff that comes before.
It's a good question. I have to think about that. I think at least the one thing I probably am, I think the maternal custody point is probably the most important of the things I'm probably assuming that people know. I'm assuming that people probably know. I think I don't think that's a terrible stretch to think that people know.
Well, I think most people assume that.
Yeah,
they think.
So that's an interesting question, because now what you end up suggesting is, if I invoke the kind of rational expectation story, right? And maybe that isn't, what happens if we drop, if I am making that assumption, what happens if we drop it? I have to think about that.
My guess is most married couples, the majority, don't even know what no-fault divorce is. I haven't even thought about it one way or the other. People aren't schooled in that before they get married. You don't have to take a course in divorce law before they get married.
So that's a more interesting proposal than.
Yeah, but a lot of people are in families who have had divorce in their family. So it's less rare today than ever before.
Probably.
Yeah. But
maybe.
What's the correlation between that and sort of knowing enough to, yeah, that's an interesting question. I think Paul's right? We're certainly more exposed to divorce than we were before. There may be, there also may be availability bias issues that you remember the really bad divorces, and right, or that may affect what you think you know about divorce law. That's a real. I got to sit down with the paper kind of now, Roy, and go back through it and think about that question, and see both if, where, and what difference. So yeah, that's a good question. All right, someone else can ask another one. The spontaneous. Sorry, go ahead.
Charles Murray talks about college as a mating, a place that facilitates the mating markets.
Yep.
And also the increasingly hierarchical structure of higher education with extensive sorting liability.
Yep.
Which would seem to suggest perhaps better matches. So that's one trend, and there seems to be a counter trend, which is that college no longer seems to be serving that purpose. That is, dating and marriage is soon after college seems to be going away. I wonder, just comment on those.
Yeah, well, I mean, assortative mating, right, is the story, that people tend to marry people like themselves, right? I mean, part of it is people tend, I mean, the way that it's usually put in some textbook treatments is people tend to marry others who have accumulated similar human capital, right? So educated people tend to marry educated people and so on. So that's the first part of your story. And I think, you know, people used to joke, and it was true in the 50s and 40s, 50s, even into the 60s, about women going to college to get their MRS degree, right? That was the mating pool, that's what you did. Upward mobility, in particular, was you went to college and then you sort of sorted it out. Even at my place, right, we joke with our freshmen, and places like mine tend to do this, right? You know, imagine 600 freshmen in a circle and say, look around you, the odds that you marry someone here, right, are, you know, not insignificant. Less than they used to be, but not insignificant. So yeah, I mean, but it might be what's happening now is, and again, I'm thinking on my feet here, that the generic college degree becomes a signal about the future, and a signal about interests, and a signal about context. So you don't have to actually meet someone in college necessarily, but you tend to see college, you know, the college degree match with a college degree. Because I'm thinking, right, there is this whole other interesting thing going on now with educated women, right, in which educated women, I'm trying to have to reconstruct the argument in my head now because I wasn't going to run this through. It turns out that educated women care more about marrying a man with equal or greater education than educated men do about women. So educated men don't care nearly as much about the education level of the women they marry as educated women do, right? And so this becomes, now we've got a sort of market disequilibrium problem here, right? That educated women are looking for prospective partners on a criterion that their partners don't care about very much, right? And so there's some story, you can tell some stories here about women finding the marriage market very thin, right? Because they're looking for more educated men, but the more educated men aren't necessarily looking for that, right? Or equal or more educated men. They may be looking across the board. So the pool of men that educated women are looking for is fairly small, because those men are being pulled in all kinds, have preferences that don't align with women. I gotta make sure I'm getting that right. So there's some of that mismatch happening. And the other thing we should talk about, of course, is how are people meeting these days? One way they're meeting is through the transaction cost reducers of eHarmony and Match.com and these kinds of things, right? Where you spread, you spread the criteria and the pool out, right, of meeting someone online that way, right? And that may be what you can think of what eHarmony tries to do with their 29 questions, whatever, right? As to sort of cut that signaling process short and make it much easier, right? We'll take care. You pay us. We'll tell you, right? Who you might be a likely match with, and there's a little shred of evidence, right, that these marriages are actually do a little better, maybe, right? Not a lot, but a little. Again, and so I think there's all kinds of interesting things happening here, and part of it too, of course, is that later age of marriage means that there's more time between college and when people on average median age of first marriage. And so there's all this stuff happening in people's 20s and early 30s where they both have more opportunities to meet people, they're unlikely to be with someone they went to college with, right? And they're in more anonymous cities. How do you find people? And if we really want to go crazy, now we can throw in Tinder and all that, right? So if you really don't even want a relationship, you just want someone for the night, right? We've got transaction cost reducers there, right? But you could meet someone that way too. So I said, my son is 24, and I said to him recently, I said, I don't understand anything about the world of relationships for people in their 20s today. It's so foreign. But what we're finding is that we're seeing these institutions arise endogenously that are transaction cost reducers that help reduce the cost of finding people in a world where people are busy, and more mobile maybe, and are willing, because those costs are lower, people are also willing to take more time to make sure they get it right. So your 35 is actually, I can't remember median age off the top of my head, but it's about 30 for men right now, right? I think so. So you're not that far off. That's a rambling answer, but I think because we're in this, in some ways, this flux of things right now. But I do think there's evidence to suggest what we're getting is fewer but better marriages, because the cohort divorce rate is falling. That is, people who were married 15 years ago are less likely to divorce 15 years in than were people who were married for 15 years in previous years. So that we're seeing that divorce rate come down a little bit, and the cohort rate is coming down.
Yeah, I just had a question about a comment that you made a little bit earlier. So you said that you were thinking that making divorce easier and less costly should make marriage more likely.
All other things equal, yeah.
And I wonder if that's true given what you've said about capital specialization.
Interesting, okay.
So I'm thinking about like the paper that Armin Alshin wrote on vertical integration with Benjamin Klein and someone else. It's Crawford, Klein, and Alshin in 1978. And so they tell a bunch of stories in that article. And so one of them is about how Ford came, like in the 1920s or 30s, to merge with a paint company. And so the question is, well, why does Ford want to be making paint? Well, it's because if they had just contracted with this paint company, the paint company, like, they developed like a specialized asset, namely the type of paint that you put on a Ford. And it's like, well, if you want plum crazy purple, you can only come to us, or cherry red or whatever. Like, we're the only game in town. And so there's this avenue for opportunistic behavior after the contract was put in place. And so to avoid that, they merged and they became, one firm. And so, taking that analogy back to marriage, if you make if you make divorce actually easier, you actually open up this opportunity for that type of
Mutual hostage taking, or
like that opportunistic behavior. So I don't know what you think about that. If that's
that's an interest. That's right. So it's a comparative cost question. It seems to me, right? That if divorce, if you reduce the cost of exit, right,
mm-hmm.
and make marriage more likely, you also there may be an offsetting increase, risk anyway, that comes from the sort of hostage taking scenario. It's interesting. I mean, one of the things to remember when we think about the cost of divorce too, and how significant that would be, is divorce is much less costly when you're young and there's no kids involved,
mm-hmm.
right? I mean, most of the things we think about cost in the broadest sense, not just the lawyers, but the lawyers are cheaper too, because there's less time figuring out child support and all that kind of stuff. But the sort of full cost of divorce are much less if the couple doesn't have any kids, right? And so the question is how do I have to think that through? But yeah, that can certainly be an offsetting factor.
So does that mean you would probably expect then marriage to actually be higher among younger people?
What we have seen in recent years,
Because I think you've actually seen the opposite, right? That like people are putting off marriage to where
they are.
like, they're in their 30s.
We know the median age is high. That we know for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But there has been something of a little small trend towards what people sometimes call starter marriages, right? Where a couple gets married young, fairly young, for a few years, and they realize, this didn't work, and they don't have kids, right? That's the key.
Right.
It's 3-4 years. I don't want to reason from anecdotes, but I can think of a few examples of this. But there's some evidence for it too. That then they go, okay, that's that didn't work. And it's really easy to get out of those marriages, right? Comparatively easy, right? Just from a cost perspective, you don't have to worry about kids, and you may not have, after a few years, you may not have complicated financial assets too. So again, one of the things about all this stuff is, figuring out what all the relevant costs and benefits are. There's a lot going on.
Do you know what the time trend is for so you said with divorce it kind of went up after no fault and then leveled off. What about just marriage rates? Did that go down?
Marriage rates is much more consistent down. I mean, there's some blips, right? But much more consistent. Marriage rates and median age of first marriage, which obviously are connected, right? Because in any given slice of time, right? If median, so marriage rates are falling fairly steadily and median age is I have to double check that. I actually have to, I teach an econ of gender and family class, and class on Monday is exactly this topic. So
because if marriage was falling, that's sort of what you'd expect if the opportunistic behavior was actually what was driving. So divorces you'd expect to go up and marriages to go down.
Yeah, I mean, it could be another, it absolutely could be another contributing factor. I think I have a tendency sometimes to say, and someone corrected me earlier, I tend to say the, right, when I probably mean and.
A,
Or-
yeah.
Right, yeah, so, because it's, all this stuff is so multiple.
Is that median age of first marriage?
First marriage, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, first marriage, yeah.
Can you speak a little bit to about the threshold of self-comparison, of comparing yourself to your significant other, and how that affects maybe the relationship and further on maybe the divorce rate? For
What do you
instance,
think
for
of
instance, you said earlier about the women wanting a higher, same education or higher, but in turn that's comparing themselves with somebody else, and I was just kind of.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly, I mean, I think it's not, I don't know if comparison's the right word. I mean, I think it's just, certainly a preference, right? That the evidence indicates that women, imagine what some of the reasons might be, but women just have a stronger preference for marrying someone who is at least as educated as they are. So, I mean, what's the question? The question is why, or why do they have that preference, or why that matters?
I understand why they have the preference, but why? I guess why? Yeah, why does it matter? And where is the limit? I guess within the relationship. When does it become a negative connotation?
That I don't know the answer to. I mean, it'd be interesting. For example, is do we see higher divorce rates among marriages of people of very
Who are
different
higher
ages?
educated
Yeah,
or
very
lower
different.
educated,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I honestly, I don't know the empirics on that, so I can't. But that would be an interesting question to ask, right? Did education? Are there? I don't know. Put
Do
this.
we become
Do
so
there-
self-aware?
Yeah, or are there are the
ourselves?
expectations behind those preferences? How much do they really matter? As it turns out, is it a belief that people have, but it turns out isn't really important to a successful
And of
marriage?
course, we evolve over, so how does that change?
And remember, I mean, in economics, it's the ex ante beliefs that matter, right? So as long if the woman believes that having an equally or higher educated husband is important, that's going to explain their actions. It may turn out ex post that matters or doesn't matter, but that's the interesting part. Right? That might explain. If we want to explain divorce rates, we're looking at the ex post, right? How does it actually work out? But if we're explaining marriage rates, we're looking at ex ante preferences. Right? So yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't know the comparative, because I know more about the marriage issue, and again, it's an explanation that some people use for why educated women find the marriage market so difficult, is that the pool of men that they're effectively drawing from is particularly small, and particularly it's harder for them to find a match because the men have a broader set of preferences. So you have to look at this.
I think in the second shift section, you make a comparison, a data comparison that's not relevant.
Okay. I love it when
you look at the amount of hours done between men and women at work at home after work, and 19.9 compared to 10.9 today. And then you compare that to the wage gap for men and women,
as opposed
not
to
husband and wife.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay.
And it seems to me that it could, the point is if it's wider for husband and wife than it is for men and women generally, which actually seems to me could be
Right.
lighter.
That does seem.
That could make a difference in your argument.
Yes, it could. Yes, it could.
Because the wider that gap between men and women, between a husband and wife and wage could explain the wider gap in the other direction,
Yep.
right? In the amount of work they do at home.
Good. No, I think that's right. That's right. Yeah. I'll have to play with that. I think that's right. And things we know, right? We know that the gender wage gap is wider for men and women who have children than men and women who don't, right? I mean, if you want to see the gender wage gap disappear, right, compare apples to apples and look at people 25 to 30 who've never had children, right? And the gender wage, in fact, by some measures, women do better, right? So the gender wage gap disappears once you start putting children in. So there's really three categories here. There's, the sort of single, no kids. What's the husband-wife wage gap? What's the, husband-wife wage gap with kids, right? And then the other, of course, question is, there's some endogeneity issues there too, right? Because one of the reasons the gap exists, presumably, is because women are home caring more, right? So what's causing what there? So there's some. So what also suggests is that when Mackenzie and Tulloch made that prediction in 1975, they weren't perhaps being very careful either in the way. I have to go back and see exactly how they worded that. But yeah, that's a good point. I have to think that through. Thank you. Yeah.
I have a question. As women become more equal with the salary and the wage, and say in the future they become more the breadwinners per se compared to the men, how do you see the child custody percentage changing? Especially after you were saying that the social trends aren't exactly changing with the salary and wage trend.
That's it's a really interesting question, right? And I think one of the things we're seeing now is more men trying to fight custody decisions that they think were unfair, right? I mean, and we do see, we certainly do. It's true. Men today certainly spend more time parenting involved with kids than did their fathers or their fathers' fathers. No question about that, right? So the case to be made that physical custody should be more evenly split, right? But here's the problem. It's not clear whether it's good for kids to split 50-50 physical custody. What does that mean, right? And especially if they're school-age kids, mom and dad have to be in the same school district, right? And if mom and dad are living 500 miles apart, right, someone's going to have them more off. So, which is why oftentimes, we see these high-stakes custody battles, and where men are saying, why are you just assuming they should stay with her? So, I think the one prediction I'd make is that as we see all of this stuff equaling out, both in the market, but also men doing more home, which they are, right, and be involved more with their kids more, that we may see ongoing challenges to that default. And it's historically, by the way, if you go sort of way back to the 19th century and earlier, actually men were favored in cases, and divorce was of course much less frequent, but in cases where the children had to go to one parent or the other, men were frequently favored, and again, there was, they were the lord and master of the house kind of thing, and also had the income and so on. And it's really post the Victorian era, post the late 19th century, when women became thought to be responsible for the domestic sphere as their place, right? And that's when we get Mother's Day and all these kind of other, right? This sort of cult, the kind of cult of motherhood. Then we began to see in the early 20th century the courts began to change, right? And see that the best interest of the child was served by being with mom because she was we can finish the story. So it's not as if it has always been the case that the law has recognized women as being the ones who sort of have the default presumption. So again, this is a good example, right, of endogenous response, right? Is the law, are the assumptions in the law now in the way of what might be a good solution? And let me just sort of say one more thing here. I think, I used to say, when people would ask me, what's the hardest sort of issue most complicated issue to think about when you think about sort of how markets work and how we get these sort of endogenous processes to coordinate? I used to say, large-scale environmental issues, right? Global warming, whatever, right? Sort of those kinds of things. But now I don't say that anymore because a bunch of reasons. But one of them is I think it's anything having to do with children, right? Anything having to do with children is complicated and messy and gray and weird, and no political philosophy, no social theory can answer all those questions. And so here you go, right? It should make, you can see why men would say, look, I want 50-50 custody. And you say, but we can't, what does that mean, right? And how do we sort that out? And so judges are under face real complexities in trying to figure out how to do justice to the parents, but be responsible for the best interests of the child. I wouldn't want to be a family court judge. Good luck.
And those judges have no jury, right?
No, usually not. I mean, they're, first of all, it's actually quite rare that divorces go to court, right? I mean, most divorces are settled by the two parties working with lawyers to come up with an agreement that's then presented to a judge who says, you guys all agree to this? Yup. Judge looks at it and goes, okay, if you guys, there's nothing outrageous here, you guys agreed to it, sign, you're divorced, right? It's only when the parents, the married couple, I guess you normally say, but usually parents, can't come to an agreement despite working with the lawyers, that one or the other party says, now we gotta go to court, and the judge has to decide. In family law, there's no jury, right? You know, there's, I mean, the TV version of the divorce with the widow and the black, you know, with the divorcee and the black veil, right? You know, coming in and saying, oh, no, right? I mean, it doesn't work that way. So yeah, it's judges, and it's, you know, it's, they have a fair amount of discretion as well. They've got some, you know, they have a case law precedent, but it's, again, cases, divorce cases with kids in particular are so idiosyncratic that it's hard to say, well, this is just like that one, so we'll do this. Kids mess up. Other questions?
I've always had trouble with this anyway, but maybe you can help me. The sort of evolution of law in the way you describe it with respect to marital law to sort of comport with these changing practices. How do you envision that evolution occurring? I mean, you know, it's probably my, you know, central planning mind that wants to think, well, somebody's got to change those laws. And I mean, are you envisioning sort of a common law process or an administrative law process or
a case law process, right? I mean, I think
are these rules that are typically handled through common law?
Yeah, yeah. Well, a couple things. I mean, family law, it's common law, and it's also interestingly almost all still at the state level, right? Which is why the decision, the Oberfell versus Island, the Hodge decision, was part of the controversy there. Was that historically family law, marriage law has been state level law, and so there is some ability to experiment by state here, right? I mean, even no fault, right? Started in California and a couple of states, and then spread through an imitation process. So again, and I think part of what you see happen is judges, like we're just talking about, being frustrated by trying to apply precedent and analogize from other cases to cases that confront them, and realizing things have changed, this isn't like that. And then they, you know, they're trying to come up with new fixes, some of which is bound by administrative law. So like the multi-parent family thing, right? You can't, it's not, as I understand it, and I'm pushing the limits of my legal knowledge, as I understand it, a judge can't just say, 3 of you have parental rights, right? Judge can come up with a clever kind of, you know, support or contract type agreement that lets some people do some things, but they can't, you know, they can't legally kind of change the overarching structure of the law, which is why you see things like the ABA model legislation. One of the things that the American Bar Association and other organizations do is propose model legislation or model laws that are sort of being, if you want to think of it this way, being kind of legal political entrepreneurs, right? Who want to offer an alternative model that might change both the legislature, but might more importantly influence judges, right? And I think, again, I don't, you know, thinking through the process of influence here is interesting, but I would think frustrated judges would have some influence over legislators. They would also have some influence over lawyers who are parties to the case, who might also begin to push for change. Lawyers realizing the way we do this doesn't make sense anymore, right? So they start going, can we think about other ways of doing it? And if you work with the ABA or law schools, and you sort of have this kind of slow process of social change. But I think a lot of it does come from the bottom up, from having to, like in the common law, right? Having to decide particular cases, think about like Benson's enterprise of law type stuff, right? Where deciding particular commercial cases, you work with precedent, but if it's new, you try to apply and it changes things, and someone looks at that and goes, yeah, that's the right thing. So you get this kind of, you know, Mengerian innovation imitation process. I think it's more complicated with the family law stuff because it's not just judges and cases, it's also, there is an administrative law, state law. Yeah, so Paul, you first.
Yeah. I have a little bit of a problem with, and it doesn't really detract from your paper, your analysis, but you said the family is like a firm, and you're trying to make this analogy, and I don't think that's really a good way to go, and here's why. You know, firms, they have a clear goal, right? We want to maximize profit, or at least the value of the firm and such. And with families, what you have is, well, maybe we want to increase the amount of leisure for the parents, and so, or maybe it's a different goal, like maybe we want the next generation, and it's all about the kids, or maybe it's some other goals, right? So it's not one common goal that we see that firms, regardless of what they do, they have, you know, the same sort of goal. And so then you end up retreating, saying, well, I don't know what a successful family is, but I know what a failed family is, right? Because that's a divorce. So that's a pretty low threshold there, because you're not defining what's successful, but you're only defining what failure is. And so it looks like what you have is that very non-Austrian black box, right? What's a firm? It's a black box. Things go in, stuff comes out. What happens in there? I don't know. So if instead we reject that non-Austrian stuff, and if you only look at, you know, your analysis on cost, your opportunity cost, your incentives, your specialization, your comparative advantages, I think you can get, you know, the same sorts of arguments and analysis and conclusions without any of that extra stuff.
So,
I guess
Yeah,
the
I
argument
know.
is why make that analogy and why try to put that in there? I don't see it adding to you.
Okay.
If anything, it's detracting.
okay, I disagree with you about that, about the ultimate value of it. But you're right, I mean, all analogies have their limits, that's why they're analogies, right? So that's why I'm careful to say like a firm. And then maybe I should be more careful to say like a firm in the following ways, right? I'm not sure, I think one line of response would be that there's more people thinking about firms these days in terms of multiple goals, right? That while you're right, they still have to earn profits to stay alive, okay? They may have other goals rather than maximizing profits. They might have other things that they wish to do. I mean, again, you can think of John Mackey here and the way he talks about, you know, he thinks about entrepreneurship, right? I know, I without saying, oh boy, that was a big sigh.
No, I just thought about something, I thought something that would favor your argument.
Okay, all right, go ahead. I'm always willing to.
No, I just wanted to point out that Hayek, when he discusses organization versus spontaneous order or catallaxy, he lumps in the firm and the family,
Yes.
and right?
Yes.
So he puts them in the same category.
Right. Yeah, he does. But I think what's right in Paul's, one of the things that's right in Paul's comment, because there's more than one that's, see, you know, I love you, Paul. But one thing that's is that it is true, it's hard to pin down one clear measure of success in the way that profits are for a firm. And that's, you know, when I talk about this with my undergraduates, right? You know, okay, firms maximize profits. You know, you can think of other organizations, right? That in the Hayek sense, an army wants to win the war, right? A team wants to win the game. What's the unifying goal of a family, right? Well, maximize love, right? So, I mean, there's multiple ones, and I do think that complicates the argument, right? But I don't think it means you have to throw out the firm analogy altogether. There is still, I mean, if you read, you know, the literature on economics of the family does break open the black box, right? And sort of talks about the way in which families have to solve organizational, principal agent problems and all those kind of things. I think it's not, you know, it's not perfect because it's not clear what, and there's multiple goals. So, and there's a more practical question, which is, you know, certainly when Peter Lewin and I started doing this stuff, and you remember Peter's at Becker Center, right? So we wanted to kind of frame this as an extension of that work. And so we at least started with the assumption that families are like firms, but if we have a more Austrian conception of the firm, can we push it? And, you know, I don't think it pushes so far that you have to abandon the analogy. There's a couple other questions in there.
Do we have time for just one more?
One more question? Okay.
Well, I don't want to, you can go ahead and ask.
Oh.
Yeah.
I just had a question about, we were talking about early about the divorce rates in marriage. I guess, in here in the United States. Have you seen any processes internationally that have been successful, or in other countries that we think we can adapt to, or we've already adapted?
With marriage, I mean, in terms of sort of sorting out those expectations?
Yes.
Yeah, most of that divorce and marriage stuff reflects, you see similar trends in other developed economies, right? So the later age of first median age of first marriage.
So it's dependent upon the socioeconomic group?
Yeah, I do think, I mean, I think the one difference is Western European countries do seem to have lower marriage rates, right? The United States is still relatively low where young people get married. Look at Sweden, Denmark, you see much more cohabitation than in the US, right? Some of that may be due, I think there's a couple reasons. To the degree that religion plays a much bigger role in the US than in those places, and people have religion-driven preferences for marriage, we would see more of it here, okay? I think also in those countries we've seen government benefits, and to some degree benefits in the private sector, but certainly government benefits are less dependent upon legal marriage. So cohabitants can get many of the same things that legally married people can. So if you want to think of these terms, what's the marginal benefit, net benefit of being legally married or cohabitating in those countries? It's much smaller than it is in the United States. So there we tend to see lower marriage rates. Divorce rate, again, I've been a while since I looked at the Western European data, but my recollection of divorce rates aren't all that different than here. I think, one last, I guess I'll close with this thought. You know, the divorce rate increase, ironically, I think, at least, again, I'm not going to go with an explanation. One contributing factor is that we've raised the stakes on marriage in the last 100 or 200 years, right? We invest marriage with all of this psychological and emotional power to it, right? And again, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, I'm just saying that we do. And what we've seen, there's been sort of two effects over the 20th century. One, we've done that, and we've sort of raised the bar. Now, if you want to stay married, I'm exaggerating a little bit, if you want to stay married, it has to be this glorious, wonderful soulmates, right? You know, right? And all this stuff we wade into it. And I think frequently when it doesn't live up to that, people are tempted to say, well, clearly this must not be a happy marriage, right? And so the desire to leave is there. At the same time, of course, so that's a preference question, right? People's preferences may have shifted as we've sort of upped the stakes. And the constraints have changed too, right? I mean, women can get out much more easily than they used to because they have the kind of financial leverage they didn't used to have. I think if you look at the combination of those two things, it shouldn't surprise us that in a wealthy, more equal society, wealthier, more equal society, in which the work of in which marriage and family become not predominantly production arrangements but consumption arrangements, it shouldn't surprise us at all that we see a much higher divorce rate than we did before, right? And I don't think you can put that toothpaste back in the tube. I think the more interesting question is, can you keep it? Yeah, can you? Yeah, I heard that. Keeping the toothpaste in the tube is a problem. Yeah, but it's not worth getting divorced though. Unless it's everywhere. But you know, maybe we can reduce it, and maybe we can, more importantly, I think about how we can tinker with the law to minimize the negative impact of divorce. But I just don't see, you know, I think that's part's here to stay. The sort of plateau kind of higher divorce rate, average higher divorce rate. That's here to stay, and it's a product of progress, ironically. So I'll leave it there. Thank you all. This was a great question.